Sean Daniels, Connor McKenna, and Nicola Vuko. Three names whispered in fear across New York's most dangerous neighborhoods. They weren't celebrities, they weren't politicians, they were street legends, men who carved their reputations in blood and left entire communities living in terror. Their rise and fall is not just a story of crime, but of survival, betrayal, and the haunting shadows that still cling to the streets they once ruled. New York City is a place many see as the land of dreams, where the streets shine with opportunity and ambition, yet beneath the glittering lights of Times Square and the sleek towers of Manhattan, there lies another world that most outsiders never witness. This hidden layer of the city pulses with a different kind of energy, one that is darker, sharper, and far more dangerous. In certain neighborhoods, the rules of life are unlike those found anywhere else. Here the streets themselves seem alive, carrying stories of broken families, desperate choices, and lives lived on the edge. Walking through these blocks after sunset is not like walking through the rest of the city. The atmosphere is heavy, as though the shadows carry secrets that don't want to be revealed. Every alley whispers a warning, every corner holds the memory of violence, and every silence hides the tension of what might erupt at any moment. The history of these neighborhoods is one of struggle and survival. Over the decades, economic hardship, neglect, and inequality laid the foundation for an environment where crime could take root. What began as small-time hustling to make ends meet grew into vast underground economies controlled by crews who operated in plain sight but beyond the reach of authority. The blocks became divided territories where loyalty was enforced with blood, and respect was not given, but taken. Graffiti-covered walls were more than art. They were signs, codes, and warnings, etched into brick and steel, marking who belonged and who didn't. The residents who had lived there for generations often found themselves trapped between two worlds, one of ordinary life and another that demanded silence and obedience to forces they could never fully escape. By day, these streets might appear calm. Children walked to school, shopkeepers opened their stores, buses rumbled down, cracked asphalt. Yet even in the daylight, tension was visible for those who knew how to see it. Watchful eyes lingered from stoops and corners, keeping track of every stranger who passed by. The sound of music spilling from windows or cars carried with it a defiant rhythm, as though the community was daring the world to forget them. But nightfall was when the true face of danger emerged. Darkness transformed everything. The same streets that looked ordinary in the sun became corridors of fear under flickering streetlights. Gunshots echoed without warning, sometimes so sudden and so close that the sound seemed to split the air apart. Police sirens screamed in the distance, too late to prevent the damage, too far away to offer comfort. What made these neighborhoods so dangerous was not just the violence itself, but the unpredictability of it. One night could pass in eerie silence, while the next would erupt with chaos. A chance encounter, a wrong glance, or even being in the wrong place at the wrong time, could change everything. The people who lived here learned how to sense danger before it arrived, reading subtle cues in the air, watching the way cars slowed down, or how groups gathered on the corner. It became a survival skill, almost instinctive, to know when to walk faster, when to disappear inside, and when to stay away from a block entirely. For those who lived outside these neighborhoods, it was easy to dismiss them as lawless or broken. But for those inside, life was not so simple. Families tried to build futures in the midst of chaos. Parents fought to keep their children away from the lure of fast money, and countless people worked tirelessly to carve out some peace in a place that offered little. Yet despite the hardship, the streets held their grip. The promise of quick power, the demand for respect, and the fear of being seen as weak kept the cycle spinning. The city around them may have never slept, but in these blocks it never truly rested either. Every night ended with the same unanswered question: what would tomorrow bring, and who would survive to see it? In the shadows of New York's busiest boroughs, something far more organized than random street crime began to take shape. The rise of the neighborhood crews wasn't sudden, it was gradual, built on years of desperation and ambition. In the late 1980s and 1990s, when opportunities were scarce and entire communities felt forgotten by the city's progress, young men turned to the only avenue that seemed open to them. At first, these groups were small, loose collectives trying to survive, hustling whatever they could. But as time went on, they transformed into structured networks, with hierarchies, codes of conduct, and strict boundaries. These crews weren't just gangs. They operated like businesses, with leaders, enforcers, and loyal members who understood that loyalty was often the only thing keeping them alive. The influence of these crews extended deep into the neighborhoods they controlled. Blocks were carved into territories, each one watched closely for intruders or rival threats. Every corner had a purpose, whether it was to sell, to watch, or to collect. A few dollars could be made by running errands, but much larger sums flowed from drugs, stolen goods, and protection rackets. This money gave the crews power, but it also chained them to endless cycles of violence. Respect was currency, and losing it was fatal. A single act of disrespect could trigger retaliation, not just against the offender, but against entire families or neighborhoods. The sense of order was ruthless, and everyone within the community felt its weight, whether they were involved or not. On the surface, many outsiders assumed these crews were chaotic groups of reckless young men. The truth was much darker. They were calculated, disciplined, and often far more strategic than anyone wanted to admit. Meetings were held in secret apartments, codes were spoken in hushed voices, and every member knew their role. At the top sat leaders who rarely exposed themselves, carefully protected from the chaos of the streets by layers of soldiers who enforced their rules. Beneath them were lieutenants who handled money, oversaw operations, and made sure the lower-level members stayed in line. And at the bottom were the street soldiers, teenagers often barely old enough to drive, sent to do the dirtiest work, guarding corners, handling product, or carrying out violent orders without hesitation. With this structure came fear, not only from within but also from the community. Residents who lived in these neighborhoods quickly learned that silence was the only safety. Speaking too much, asking the wrong questions, or even being seen with the wrong people could spark suspicion. Families who wanted no part of the violence found themselves living with its consequences anyway, navigating their daily lives around invisible lines that divided the city into dangerous fragments. A single block could feel like a different world from the next, depending on which crew held power there. As the money flowed, so did the allure. Expensive cars rolled through the streets, flashy jewelry glistened under streetlights, and parties filled abandoned spaces with music that tried to drown out the violence outside. For many young people growing up in these neighborhoods, the temptation was impossible to resist. The crews promised protection, a sense of belonging, and an identity in a world that otherwise overlooked them. Yet the same loyalty that brought them in became a trap, locking them into a cycle where betrayal, prison, or death were often the only exit. The police watched these developments with growing alarm, but the crews had grown too deeply rooted to dismantle easily. Raids and arrests came frequently, yet they never seemed to weaken the networks. For every leader taken down, another quickly rose to fill the void. The power of these crews was not just in their control of drugs or weapons, but in the way they had embedded themselves into the very rhythm of the neighborhoods. They were feared and respected in equal measure, shaping the lives of everyone around them. And as the years went on, their influence only grew stronger, pushing the city into a new era, where the battle for survival was no longer just between rival gangs. It was between entire communities and the forces that ruled them. As the crews tightened their grip on New York's toughest neighborhoods, the streets themselves became soaked in blood. Violence was no longer just a tool for control. It became the language through which power was communicated. The corners that once held laughter, music, and children playing transformed into battlegrounds, where invisible lines divided lives. Families who had lived in these neighborhoods for generations suddenly found themselves trapped in the middle of wars they did not choose. They would hear gunshots shatter the night air, sometimes so close that windows rattled and car alarms wailed. The police sirens that followed were not sounds of comfort. They were reminders that another body had been claimed by the endless cycle of revenge. The murders came so frequently that they blurred together, a grim rhythm pulsing through the boroughs. Some were deliberate, planned executions carried out with chilling precision. Others erupted from sudden encounters, a stare held too long, or a heated argument that escalated within seconds. It was not uncommon for children to walk to school past yellow tape and chalk outlines, their innocence forced to coexist with the harsh realities of their surroundings. Over time, many grew desensitized, accepting the violence as part of everyday life. But beneath the surface, fear lived in every heartbeat. As parents prayed each night that their children would return home unharmed, corners and storefronts became focal points in these wars. A small deli might appear like nothing more than a convenience shop, but after dark, it served as a hub, where drugs were exchanged and orders were whispered. A basketball court, once a place of community, might suddenly turn into the scene of a shooting, the echo of bouncing balls replaced with the crack of gunfire. Graffiti on brick walls served as both memorials and warnings, announcing which crew claimed the territory and honoring those who had died defending it. The art became a visual language of survival, one that told stories more brutally honest than any newspaper headline. Innocent residents were caught in the middle with nowhere to turn. Calling the police often meant becoming a target, and staying silent meant living with the consequence. Many families tried to protect themselves by keeping to strict routines, avoiding certain blocks, and teaching their children to recognize danger before it arrived. The very act of walking home became a strategic decision, choosing which streets to avoid, which routes felt safer, and which times of night were simply too dangerous. Yet even the most careful planning could not guarantee safety. Stray bullets did not care about routines, and many lives were lost simply because someone was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The police, stretched thin and overwhelmed, attempted to crack down with raids and patrols, but they were always steps behind. When they dismantled one corner operation, another sprang up only a block away. The crews adapted quickly, shifting their strategies and staying one step ahead of the law. To many residents, the police presence felt temporary, a performance that could not touch the deeper roots of the violence. Trust between the community and law enforcement was fragile, often broken by years of neglect, corruption, or misunderstanding. This divide made it nearly impossible to break the cycle. The blood on the corners was not just a symptom of crime. It was the result of decades of systemic failure. Poverty, unemployment, and lack of opportunity fed the desperation that kept the streets alive with conflict. For the young, joining a crew was not always about greed or power. Sometimes it was about survival, protection, or even a sense of belonging that home could not provide. And once inside, leaving was rarely an option. Betrayal was met with swift punishment, and attempts to walk away often ended in silence marked only by another mural painted on a wall. New York was a city that prided itself on reinvention, but within these neighborhoods, the same cycle played on repeat. Every shooting left behind, not just a victim, but also a grieving family, a broken community, and another seed of revenge, planted in the minds of those still living. The corners became altars to both life and death, symbols of resilience and reminders of how fragile survival really was. The blood that stained them was not easily washed away, for it carried the weight of history, anger, and pain, an inheritance passed from one generation to the next, binding the future to the violence of the past. No empire of the streets ever truly lasts, and the rise of the powerful crews in New York was always destined to collide with the relentless machinery of law enforcement. For years, federal agencies had been watching, listening, and waiting. What looked like chaos to outsiders was in fact mapped with precision by investigators who collected evidence piece by piece. Wiretaps recorded hushed conversations, surveillance vans sat quietly at the edges of neighborhoods, and undercover agents slowly infiltrated the crews by posing as trusted associates. The leaders who once seemed untouchable, hidden behind layers of loyal soldiers and silent codes, had unknowingly left trails that connected them to everything. And when those trails became strong enough, the fall began. The arrests often came at dawn. Doors were kicked open, homes raided, and handcuffs clicked shut on men who only the day before had stood as kings of their blocks. Courtrooms filled with prosecutors, presenting years of evidence, linking names to murders, drug deals, and extortion schemes. Convictions followed swiftly, and life sentences became the fate of men who had once been feared above all. The city watched as headlines declared the fall of giants, men whose names had been whispered with both fear and respect now reduced to mugshots plastered across newspapers. But the dismantling of these empires did not bring peace. Instead, it created something far more unstable. With the old leaders gone, the streets were left without a clear order. A power vacuum opened, and into that space stepped younger, hungrier, and far less disciplined crew. Where the old guard had at least understood the unspoken codes of the street, the new generation often ignored them entirely. Violence, once measured and strategic, became reckless and unpredictable. Shootings erupted over smaller disputes, and the level of chaos escalated in ways the older crews had once avoided. What had been an empire collapsed into fragmented territories where everyone was fighting for their own piece of control. For residents, the fall of the giants brought little relief. If anything, life grew more dangerous. Without central figures enforcing their rules, smaller groups acted without restraint. Conflict spread across blocks that had once been stable, and neighborhoods once dominated by a single crew now fractured into contested zones. Families found themselves living amid constant uncertainty, unsure of who controlled the streets from one week to the next. The unpredictability made survival harder, as invisible boundaries shifted and alliances changed overnight. Law enforcement too faced new challenges. Taking down the older crews had required patience and long-term strategy, but dismantling the chaotic fragments that replaced them was like trying to hold water in bare hands. The new generation was more mobile, less organized, and far harder to track. Arresting one member did little to slow their operations, because they lacked the rigid hierarchy of their predecessors. They operated in smaller clusters, slipping through cracks in the system with ease. What had once been a war between established powers had dissolved into countless smaller conflicts that spread like wildfire through the city. The cycle of violence became more personal. Where older crews had fought primarily for money and control, the younger ones often fought for pride, revenge, or reputation on social media. Entire neighborhoods could erupt over a single online post, and what might have been a trivial insult escalated into a chain of retaliation. This shift in culture deepened the danger, for there was no longer any predictability in how or why violence erupted. It was no longer only about business. It was about image, ego, and the unrelenting need to prove dominance in a world where respect was fragile and fleeting. In many ways, the fall of the giants showed that victory for law enforcement was an illusion. The old leaders had been removed, but their downfall did not end the cycle. It fractured it into something far more volatile. The city remained caught in a storm where each new generation seemed less cautious than the last, where the streets were fueled not by strategy but by chaos. The giants had fallen, but their shadows remained, and in those shadows the seeds of the next wave of violence were already beginning to grow. Even today, the scars left behind by decades of violence and turmoil are etched into the streets of New York's most dangerous neighborhood. Walking through them, it becomes clear that these scars are not only physical but deeply emotional. Abandoned buildings stand like monuments to a time when families fled to escape the chaos, their windows shattered, and doors boarded up as if frozen mid-collapse. Playgrounds once alive with children's laughter still carry the echoes of gunshots that turned them into crime scenes. On street corners, colorful murals stretch across walls, honoring young lives taken too soon. Names, dates, and faces stare out from the paint, silent reminders of the fragility of survival. These memorials are more than art. They are history written in grief, etched permanently into the identity of the community. But while some areas struggle under the weight of their past, others are slowly changing. Developers have moved in, transforming empty lots into apartments and community centers, while activists fight to give local youth opportunities their predecessors never had. Programs aimed at steering children away from gangs now operate in schools and after-hours centers, offering mentorship, sports, and creative outlets. For many, these initiatives are lifelines, pulling kids away from the cycle of crime that had consumed generations before them. Yet progress comes unevenly. For every block that shows signs of rebirth, another remains locked in poverty, unemployment, and distrust. The progress is real, but it is fragile, constantly at risk of being undone by a single act of violence.
The fear that defined earlier decades still lingers in subtle ways. Residents carry an instinct to watch their backs, to scan their surroundings, to avoid lingering on corners after dark. Parents continue to warn their children about which streets to avoid, and which friends might lead them into trouble. Even when the sound of gunfire is less frequent, the memory of it lives on, shaping decisions and behaviors. People who survived the blood-soaked years of the past know too well how quickly peace can crumble. They have seen promises of safety before, only for a new wave of violence to sweep through like an unexpected storm. The shadows of the old crews remain, even when the names and faces have changed. Stories of past leaders and notorious incidents are passed down like ghost tales, whispered in barbershops, told in late-night gatherings, and remembered in hushed tones by elders who warned the youth about what once was. These stories serve as both warnings and temptations, lessons about the dangers of chasing power, but also myths that glamorize the money and respect that came with it. The younger generation, raised on these stories and fueled by the ever-present pressure of poverty, sometimes finds it difficult to resist repeating the same patterns. For law enforcement, the struggle continues. Efforts to rebuild trust remain difficult after decades of tension, and communities often see police not as protectors, but as outsiders. Many residents still prefer silence over cooperation, fearing retaliation more than they believe in protection. This silence born of survival continues to shield the remnants of crews that linger in the background. While major operations may no longer dominate headlines, smaller networks still thrive in the shadows, keeping the cycle alive beneath the surface. Yet despite the darkness, resilience is visible. Families rebuild after tragedy, children pursue education against all odds, and communities create pockets of hope in places once written off as lost. The human spirit proves stubborn, refusing to be completely broken by years of violence. The neighborhoods continue to breathe, carrying both the weight of their past and the faint glimmer of possibility for a different future. But the truth remains haunting. The most dangerous hoods in New York are not simply defined by the crimes that happened there, but by the shadows they left behind. These shadows stretch across time, reaching into the present, reminding everyone that even when the gunshots fade, the echoes of the past are never truly silent.